In 2003, Activision published True Crime: Streets of LA for the Sony PlayStation 2. The premise of the game had the character of Nicholas Kang deal with the criminal elements of Los Angeles while dealing with various other circumstances within the game's story. One of the main aspects of popularity within the game at the time was the fact that it was one of the first non-Grand Theft Auto related open world concept games released after Grand Theft Auto 3 in 2001. Influencing factors for the game as well as the character of Nick Kang was Hong Kong-based martial arts movies. True Crime: Streets of LA proved to be mildly popular as both the game as well as the character of Nick Kang were received well by gamers and critics. Through circumstances, the original True Crime franchise had an extraordinary amount of circumstances before the franchise was abandoned by Activision in 2014. Eventually, through deals and buyouts, Square Enix later bought the rights and renamed the proposed True Crime game in development into what was later known as Sleeping Dogs, released in 2012 originally for the personal computer, Sony PlayStation 3 on Microsoft Xbox 360. Continuing with the dynamics of the True Crime franchise, the game focused on the main character of Wei Shen, a Chinese-American police officer through circumstances goes undercover as an aspiring gangster in the Hong Kong criminal underworld. The story had Wei encounter different gangs through Hong Kong and even corruption within the police force that eventually has Wei with conflicting loyalties to the people he's met through the gangs as well as his professional stance or even his career as a police officer. Upon the game's release, it was met with extraordinary praise from critics as well as positive receptions from gamers' experiences to the premise of the game as well as the authenticity of the Hong Kong setting depicted within the game. At the time, Wei Shen was considered to be that of an updated or modernized version of Nick Kang, and the fact that Wei went through such character development through the game from hardline cop to potentially ruthless Hong Kong gangster was done brilliantly. The game of Sleeping Dogs and character of Wei Shen were received so well by gamers that further content for the game was later released, being that of Nightmare in North Point, Zodiac Tournament, and Year of the Snake, all of which added to the lore and death of Sleeping Dogs, as well as the portrayal of Wei Shen. Sales of the game were high, and perceptions were that Wei Shen would be the main character of a new Sleeping Dog-based franchise. This was originally the case as in 2013, announcements were made that a sequel was being conceived of to Sleeping Dogs. The proposed sequel would have continued the story of Wei Shen, as due to the plot of the original Sleeping Dogs, in the sequel, his identity of a high-ranking Hong Kong criminal would be somewhat public knowledge within the force, but this time instead of handling cases or assignments alone, the force would have him joined by a conflicted as well as potentially corrupted partner named Henry Fong. The both of them would explore and travel through the Pearl River region of mainland China. The storyline would have went through Wei and Henry accordingly, as developers considered it to have been a potentially massive game for the time. However, due to various circumstances, the sequel was cancelled. In 2015, a spin-off on the Sleeping Dogs game was to have been released called Triad Wars, where it was a conventional massive multiplayer online game of similar themes from the Sleeping Dogs game, as the player would have assumed the persona of a customized character, not Wei Shen. From information now known, there were multiple reasons as to why the Sleeping Dogs game was never turned into a franchise, and the character of Wei Shen, though full of potential, was quietly and intentionally forgotten by Square Enix. Theories mention that at the time the game was highly ambitious, as a number of skilled actors and actresses lent their voices to the game, and a sequel might have been somewhat costly for the company considering the success of the original Sleeping Dogs, which would have translated to possibly even more expenses for a sequel of the time wouldn't have exactly been worth the trouble that would have emerged through possible development. Even more might have said that Square Enix knew of the risks on benefits to developing a Sleeping Dogs 2 on continuing the exploits of Wei Shen, but decided to abandon the potential franchise in favor of other gaming titles that they were working on developing at the time. Others mention that the Sleeping Dogs game retained much of the developmental problems that the true crime franchise was plagued with throughout its existence. The character of Wei Shen, as well as the game of Sleeping Dogs, or even the premise of Sleeping Dogs, were later considered to be one of the most underrated games of the Sony PlayStation 3 era, and the main character of Wei Shen was undoubtedly one that players would have wanted to have seen more of. Sometimes a character can be forgotten because even though they were highly respected at the time, developmental troubles as well as potential concerns quietly had them abandoned.